It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
If you don't play with guns and you're a kid, chances are you are going to play with swords or with clubs. Kids pick up a stick and they start shooting people with the stick.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm here with my wife and podcast partner and life partner, Kylie, and mum to our 6 kids. I'm the founder of happyfamilies.com.au. Yesterday, we commemorated and remembered Anzac Day and those who have fought and those who serve to keep our world and especially our country safe. It was a wonderful weekend. I hope that you had a good weekend enjoying your Anzac freedoms. We received a Facebook message, Kylie, that I think is a really interesting one as a follow-up to Anzac Day. It relates to guns and war play, gun play, our children. Let me read the question to you. It comes from Petra. She asks, have you done a podcast or do you have any information about gun and weapon play? I'm an early childhood educator. I've had lots of discussions with colleagues around this sort of play. Despite trying redirections or play idea suggestions, it seems to always resurface shortly after. What does the research show? What's the general consensus in child psychology? Is gunplay detrimental or a normal part of imagination and development? And I thought, what a great question to ask after we've just spent the last weekend remembering war and the tragedy that it is and the way guns affect our lives in so many harmful ways.
It never ceases to amaze me that even after, I guess, the enlightenment that we find ourselves in today's day and age, that our children, regardless of how they're brought up, are so driven by stereotypes.
Yeah.
You know, boys, regardless of what they see, often are just drawn to trucks and guns and karate and all of those things. I find it fascinating.
What I also find really interesting, along the lines of the Enlightenment concept that you mentioned, we know some people who won't even let their children say the word gun. Their kids wanted a nerf gun for their birthdays and the parents were aghast. They're like, no, there is no such thing. We do not have guns. It would be better if they didn't exist in the entire world. And Australia since 1996 with the gun buyback and John Howard's decision to reduce access to guns in this country in particular, we've got a pretty good track record when it comes to minimising gun violence. I mean, it still happens. There are still guns. There are bad people who have guns. They tend to usually only go after other bad people with guns, fortunately. But we're not going to get away from the reality that there are guns in society and there are guns in movies. Like I came across some research while I was thinking about what we would talk about today. Children, according to some research, who view movies with gun violence are more interested in guns and violence than their peers who do not have this exposure. So a recent experiment, 104 kids, they're aged between 8 and 12. They're in pairs. One child in each pair watches a 20-minute clip of a PG-rated film that has guns. The other sees the same film, but the scenes with guns are edited out. And after they watched the film, the kids went to a room. There was a cabinet stocked with toys, like there was Legos, Nerf guns, games where they could play pretty much anything they wanted. And one of the cabinet drawers had a real semi-automatic 9mm handgun that had been modified so that it couldn't fire. Because it's America, it's not Australia. I know some people are having heart failure right now. There was a gun in the room. It was modified, it couldn't fire. But the kids could still pull the trigger. And the gun had a sensor that would count the number of times that the child pulled the trigger. After 20 minutes of play in the room without adult supervision and with the door closed, the 52 pairs of kids, 43 pairs found the gun, 14 pairs gave the gun to the research assistant and said, look what I found. But in 22 pairs, one or both of the participants handled the gun, and compared with those who saw the movie where the images of guns were edited out, the kids who saw the gun in the movie, they played with the real gun significantly longer, 53 seconds versus 11 seconds. And those who were exposed to the guns in the movie also pulled the trigger more often, nearly 3 times versus 0 times for the kids who didn't. And by the way, there was a gender difference. Boys pulled the trigger, no surprise, more frequently than girls. There we go. So, our kids are going to see guns. They're going to be exposed to the concept of guns. We had Anzac Day yesterday where There were gun salutes and imagery with guns. I mean, we know that this is a part of life. And when you have families who are saying we don't even use the word, and you look at Petra's conversation, her question, I think that it's an interesting place for us to discuss and spend some time working out the best way forward for parents.
I've got a bunch of questions to ask you about this because this research is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Is gunplay actually related to violence?
There is a little bit of research that says that it is. But it's not particularly strong research, and we've got scant evidence across the board when it comes to kids and playing with guns. So let me preface this by saying I'm not an advocate of guns or gunplay. We don't have guns in our home. We've had a couple of Nerf guns over the years, but we're not gunplay people, and our kids aren't gunplay kids. Mind you, we've got 6 girls.
A couple of weekends ago, we actually walked through a house that we were thinking we might buy.
Yes.
And I opened up the storage cupboard underneath the staircase. You'd made it halfway up the stairs, and I said,
Come back and look at this.
You have to come back and look at this. Inside that cupboard, wall-to-wall Nerf guns. There was every size possible.
Yeah, I reckon there was 30 Nerf guns in there. Apparently,
more.
This
There was
family
more.
had 3 boys, if I remember correctly. And I was like, I'm buying it just for that.
so
I was like, we're not having Nerf gun wars in our family, in our home. But what the research seems to suggest is that playing with guns, if you're a child, doesn't necessarily predict anything in terms of violence. It does predict interest in firearms, as we've seen from that previous study. But the little bit of evidence suggests that it does. A lot more evidence, although there's still not much of it, suggests that it doesn't. And the other thing is, if you don't play with guns and you're a kid, chances are you are going to play with swords or with clubs or with knives or with something else. Like kids... Sticks, yeah. I mean, the kids pick up a stick and they start shooting people with the stick. They get
What about a cyber? What do you call those things?
A cyber? What did you call it?
A cyber thing. What is it?
A cyber thing. Oh, like a laser gun.
Yeah,
something.
what is it?
People can't see what you're doing with your hand right now. Kylie's got her 2 fingers extended. In
The Star Wars thing. What is it?
a lightsaber.
A lightsaber.
Right. Yeah, so children will do that. I know of one parent who told me that their son, because he wasn't allowed to play with guns, he chewed his sandwich into the shape of a gun, so that he could run around holding his sandwich and going, chew, chew, chew. I mean, I remember one time...
It's pretty limp, that one.
I was driving down the freeway with a couple of kids in the car. We were doing a church activity and I had some of the boys in the car. And there's this kid sitting in the back seat behind me. And as the cars would go past... on the other side of the road.
Them?
No, he was shooting through the gaps, like choo, 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 and then a choo, choo, and then a car would go past and he'd pause and then choo, 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 and then so we'd see how many shoos he could do in between, just with his fingers. Like, this is, and then we've got first-person shooter games. Like, kids are going to play it. You can ban Fortnite all you like, but the kids are going to figure out a way to play it at their friend's house because they want to be playing it because everyone else is doing it. What we're going to do in just a sec is come back after the break and talk about whether or not playing with guns predicts aggression in children as opposed to actual violence. Like, do they become more aggressive? And we're also going to talk about, well, a handful of other things that I think any parent who has children who play with guns or doesn't want them playing with guns is going to want to hear. Just when you think you've got this parenting gig nailed, your child hits some new milestone that leaves you figuratively banging your head against the wall. You wonder, where's the instruction manual? Your growth guide is that instruction manual, a webinar outlining basic milestones so you know where your child's at, where they're going, and what you can expect. Get insights, reassurance, and support from your growth guide. Available online at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. I'm interested, does gunplay promote antisocial behaviour?
There's no evidence that it does. What it promotes is fantasy and role play. We know that there's a big social learning component, but no, antisocial behaviour, aggression, that kind of thing. If it does, what research would suggest is that there are other things that predict that antisocial behaviour, that aggressive behaviour, that violent behaviour far more. So family environment, media consumed, corporal punishment. There's a whole range of other factors that are going to predict much more than whether your kids play with guns, whether they'll be aggressive or violent, whether they're going to have interest in firearms and that kind of thing. Whether you let your kids play with a Nerf gun or not, almost zero impact. Like, we really, it's so negligible based on what I can read in the research that if your kids want to play with a water pistol or a bubble gun or a Nerf gun, let them. That's the short version of this.
Yeah, so what happens if parents actually ban them? Or in this case, you've got schools and childcare centres that are actually banning the play of gun. Is there any negative impacts to that?
Yeah, and I think we need to acknowledge why this is happening. So it's pretty horrible when you see your children pretending to shoot each other and hearing them say, "I killed you, you're dead." Like that. As a parent, now that we understand mortality in ways that we didn't when we were 4 or 6 or 12, it's jarring and it's painful. Like it just feels horrible. I think that, well, two things. First of all, if you've banned them and you think you've been successful, chances are you're just not turning around fast enough to catch them because they're doing it. But what you're going to find is if you ban it, what you're probably going to do is your children will become deceitful. They'll hide it. "Don't you ever let me catch you playing with guns." "Don't worry, Mum, you won't. I'm going to be real sneaky from now on," that kind of thing. Or you're going to induce shame. Your children will feel really shameful for doing something that, I'm not going to say it almost comes naturally, but they want to do it. Their friends are doing it. They've seen it in the movies. It's a fun game. They really don't understand death in the same way that we do, and they don't understand war in the same way that we do, and we can't expect them to. So it might be unfair. And gunplay is really about, it's symbolic, right? If I've got the gun, we can learn lessons about control and power. We can learn lessons about authority. And so I think that gunplay could instead of having it shamed and pushed away, we could use it to have really interesting conversations with our kids about empathy and consideration.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. As you were talking, I was just thinking about all of the kinds of conversations that open up as we talk to them about how they felt when they shot their friend and how their friend felt when they were now no longer a part of the game because they were dead.
Yeah.
And, all of those kinds of conversations that you actually miss out on having because you don't want to go there at all.
Yeah. I also think that banning guns or banning gunplay, I should say, whether it's with sticks or with the Nerf gun or whatever, it's sexist. Like it unfairly disadvantages boys because boys are the ones who are significantly more likely to want to play guns and experiment and explore and role play and have fun with that kind of play. Some people might think that I'm going too far with this one, but I think that girls are less likely to involve themselves in this kind of imaginary play. The research shows, as stereotypical as this is, the research shows that girls are much more likely to play with dolls, and the dolls don't shoot each other.
No, but I remember with all of our kids, one of our favourite little, I guess, quirks and playtime, was they'd give you the look and Mum will die.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And then Mum would need a kiss of life.
Yep.
And I'd be brought back to life. Like there is so much about that cause and effect.
Yeah, and the fantasy element is really big. It's really important.
And while, we're having this conversation when there are countries around the world that are literally war-torn at the moment, and you can see how sensitive these kinds of conversations can be for people who are actually living this right now, the reality is when you understand why children play, you understand that it's them making sense of the world around them. And when they see these things, whether they, kind of see them with their friends, watching a movie or playing a video game, their reenactment of it is helping them make sense of what is happening, why it's happening, how do I feel about it, processing the world as they see it. And it's such a powerful way for them to work through it. And you being open to having conversations with them as a result of that is even more powerful.
Yeah, beautifully said. Let's wrap this up with a couple of tips for how we can set boundaries around gunplay. Because I'm going to argue, as a result of everything we've talked about today, that while most parents probably don't want to encourage it and aren't thrilled about it, I know some will be, but many parents aren't, and that would include us, it's probably going to happen. And shaming your kids around it and taking away that fantasy may not be helpful. I think that there's a couple of boundaries that we can set. The first one is that kids need to understand that they're not allowed to physically hurt each other, even if they're involved in pretend play. There are safety risks. They're not allowed to throw the gun at each other. They're not allowed to hit people with guns. They need to keep it fantasy. That would be the first boundary. The second one is that somebody could lose an eye here, kids. So you're not allowed to shoot people anywhere near their heads. Always shoot from the shoulders down. We don't want somebody to cop a Nerf bullet, one of those foam bullets in the nose or mouth or eyes. It's just not okay to shoot people there. And the third thing is, I think we just want to be mindful that there are some red flags when it comes to gunplay. Kids will often say, I accidentally did it. But if we see a recurring pattern of somebody accidentally and consistently hurting others, or if we see really aggressive behaviour, or if we see particularly exploitative or manipulative behaviour associated with that gunplay, if there's a lack of empathy involved in that gunplay, then I think that it's worth having a conversation with your child and making sure that we're teaching them the things that matter most here and that they're being sensible in what they're doing.
I think the conversation that we're really having is about everybody being a participant and enjoying the process, right? I think back to one of the episodes on parental guidance last year with the water gun fight.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. Everybody was having fun. There was, laughter and excitement, and there was no sense of violence portrayed. And I think that if, as parents, sometimes we get so heavy-hearted about things. If we can find ways to channel specifically at this point, our boys who have a desire to have this, kind of this play.
And the girls who do.
Let's have a water fight. Let's have a Nerf gun fight. And let's just have some fun.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. If you'd like more info about making your family happier, you can join us at happyfamilies.com.au.